On January 14th, 1942, the first ship was torpedoed and sunk off America's east coast. So began the U-boat's so-called Second Happy Time. From January until August 1942, U-boats sunk over 3 million tons of shipping off the U.S.'s Atlantic and Gulf coasts. This was partly due to America's hesitation in accepting the realities of the U-boat threat in the Atlantic, partly due to its focus on the Pacific War, and partly due to a complete lack of enough escorts. To help compensate for the lack of small but numerous sub-hunters, literally hundreds of private yachts, including the former presidential yacht Mayflower, were seized and pressed into service as patrol ships. Mostly manned by the Coast Guard, these ships were lightly, if at all, armed. Their main purpose was to find any U-boats, then call in proper ships or planes for prosecution. So precarious was the situation in early 1942 that several British anti-submarine escorts were hurriedly reverse lend-leased to the U.S. These included 10 British-built Flower-class corvettes that were transferred in March through June 1942 as the Temptress class. Additionally, 15 modified Flowers were sold to the U.S. while under construction in Canada. 8 were commissioned as the Action class between November 1942 and August 1943, while the remaining 7 were resold to the British before entering service. The best of the group was the 2 British River-class frigates. Built in Canadian shipyards, they were sold to the U.S. in July 1942 while under construction, and commissioned as the 2 ships of the Asheville class in December 1942. Given the insatiable need for escorts, the U.S. started a virtual repeat of these Americanized River class. 75 of the 1,260-ton Tacoma class were commissioned starting in mid-1943, with 21 more being completed for the Royal Navy as the Colony-class frigate. Visually, these ships were virtually identical to the Everts-class DEs. Internally, however, they were very different. To help speed construction, they were built to merchant rather than stricter military standards, which affected things like subdivision and hull strength. This was due to the fact that with Navy yards working around the clock, these ships could only be squeezed in by having them built in smaller yards that had virtually no experience in building warships. Most of the ships that served in the Atlantic were built on the Great Lakes, while most Pacific ships were built on the West Coast. While being Navy ships, unlike the 2 Asheville's, all the Tacomas were manned by Coast Guard crews. Mechanically, with the DE program suffering from shortages, it's not surprising they had to make do with an even more austere propulsion: triple expansion reciprocating engines. This archaic machinery caused constant problems, and many ships had to have their engines repaired or even totally rebuilt before the Navy would even take possession of them from the builders. Many Pacific ships were sent to the front, providing fire support in places like New Guinea and landing the initial raiders at Leyte Gulf. Like the Asheville's and most other Coast Guard manned escorts, these ships were originally designated patrol ships or PGs. They were redesignated frigates or PFs in early 1943 before entering service. 28 ships were lend-leased to the Soviet Pacific Fleet starting in July 1945. All were returned in 1949. Main armament was 3 3-inch 50-caliber dual-purpose guns in single open mounts, 2 forward and 1 aft. 2 depth charge rails were fitted at the stern, and 8 depth charge launchers were carried. As mentioned, propulsion was from 2 boilers venting to 1 funnel that drove triple expansion reciprocating engines. These generated 5,500 horsepower to 2 shafts, giving these ships a top speed of 20 knots. Like the DEs, they had 2 rudders. With the U-boat war in the Atlantic winding down near the end of the war, the Atlantic ships were modified as weather balloon tenders. The rear 3-inch gun was removed and a weather balloon inflation station was fitted. Fortunately, no Tacomas were sunk during the war. As the war ended, these ships, along with the Asheville's and all the other patrol ships, became surplus and were quickly scrapped or sold to Allies.